What did we go over last week? Okay. We were finishing up what chapter? John chapter 8. And the very last part of John chapter 8 is what? Before Abraham was, I am. Right? So we had gone through, Jesus had basically said that you are children of the devil, right? That you have the characteristics of Satan, that he lies and he's a murderer, right? We talked about the flow of the argument that we see as a pattern often in these types of discussions. We talked about the fact that there is this attitude of objectivity, right? And then there's the attitude of objectivity, then there is the nitpicking, and then there is the ad hominem arguments, and then finally there is the shutdown of the conversation. And that we see this pattern in this passage, right? That it starts out this investigation, which is really not an investigation of Christ's claims, and then they go through and they start nitpicking that you are contradictory in your statements, and then they go through, isn't it true that you're a Samaritan and you have a demon? And then it goes down to the shutdown, which is at the end, they pick up stones to stone him. Right? So we looked at that, and at the end it says, so the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. And therefore they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. So, to start off with, there's no ambiguity in his statement that before Abraham was born, I am. Right? There's been lots of the Jehovah's Witnesses, if you bring them to this, they have elaborate arguments on why that's not a statement of Christ's deity. But obviously, the Jews in this situation understand it to be a statement of his deity. They understand it to be a blasphemous statement in their opinion, and they're obviously going to try and put him to death. Now, this stoning would have been seen as a spontaneous action on the part of a violent mob, right? This is not a judicial kind of formal administration of capital punishment, and so chances are that the Romans would not have really looked too closely at that. Jesus was not a Roman citizen, and so the stoning of a non-Roman citizen by an angry mob was not that big a deal in the Romans' opinion, right? A formal accusation, trial, and execution would have been a very big deal because it would have usurped Roman authority and Roman law, right? So there's this difference that if they had have stoned Jesus there, it would have been frowned upon, but it wouldn't have been a huge violation of Roman law, right? Because that's the attitude the Romans had to non-Roman populace. Okay, now, Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. And we see that happens a few times in Jesus' ministry, that he either passes through the crowd, or he's hidden, or he escapes, whatever. It's this miraculous kind of passing out of the crowd, right? And so there's many different ideas about how that takes place, but it really doesn't matter. His time had not yet come, as is stated over and over and over again, that he is operating on the basis of God's timetable, and nobody can touch him. He is indestructible until the right time. Just the same as you and I. We are indestructible in this world until our time is up. Which is an odd thing to do. I don't encourage you to go, skydiving without a parachute or bungee jumping without a cord. That's not what it means, right? That's not what I'm getting at. I'm saying that when God determines that your time is up, your time is up and there's nothing you can do about it, but your time will not be up until He decides. That is His sovereign. He determines the end and the means, right? The timing and the means. So the way in which you die and the timing of your death is in absolute control by God, as it is with Christ at this point. Okay, the thing that my mind went to is, what exactly are the disciples doing during this? Right? So Jesus is teaching. This is an aside. Jesus is teaching, and the disciples are there, and they pick up stones to stone Jesus, and He slips out of the temple. I'm just curious as to what they're doing, right? Because it doesn't mention what they're doing at the time. And obviously, they're not the target and the focus, so they can basically leave on their own. But anyways, that is the end of chapter 8. Right? That is where we finish off with chapter 8, is Jesus leaves the temple. And so we start off on chapter 9, and it says, as He passed by, He saw a man blind from birth. And His disciples asked Him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? Jesus answered, it was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of Him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Okay, so we want to set the stage for the narrative in chapter 9, because it's important. Just like when we were looking at chapter 7 and chapter 8, we needed to remember and put into context to get the understanding of what the Holy Spirit, through the Apostle John, is emphasizing. Right? And so, just like 7 and 8 were related to back to chapter 5, what happened in chapter 5? Because chapter 7 and 8 were related to what happened in chapter 5. So, the pool of Bethesda, right? There was a healing on the Sabbath at the pool of Bethesda of a man who had been lame for 38 years, right? So there is this connection. So when they confront him, you said, if you testify about yourself, your testimony is not true. That quote was from the dialogue that happened as a result of the healing on the Sabbath at the pool of Bethesda, right? That is the connection between 7 and 8 and chapter 5. Here we have Jesus has left the temple, and now He is going by a beggar who has been disabled since birth. Right? Does this beggar ask to be healed? It's not a trick question. No, he does not ask to be healed. Does the beggar at the pool of Bethesda ask to be healed? No, he doesn't. So neither one of these ask to be healed. Jesus is passing by, and He draws attention to the person. At this one, the disciples draw attention to the person. It is on what day does the one at Bethesda take place? On the Sabbath. What day does this one take place? On the Sabbath, right? Jesus heals the person, asking them to do something, right? Then Jesus is not around. Then the person is investigated by the Pharisees. Then Jesus finds the person, and there is a discourse between the person and Jesus, and then there's it flows into a longer discourse by Jesus, right? That is the pattern of both of these occurrences. Both of these healings have very, very similar structure, right? There is marked differences between the two healings that we're going to go over, but this entire section, 5 and 7 and 8 and 9, are all very closely linked. They all follow a particular teaching. And so we need to be aware of this. One is by the pool of Bethesda. One has to do with the pool of Siloam. What is the significance of the pool of Siloam? Siloam. Where did the pool of Siloam come from? We went over this. Okay, there was a king. What was the king's name? Hezekiah's tunnel. Right. Hezekiah made a tunnel. Why did he make a tunnel? Because he liked tunnels. He's part gopher. Why did he make a tunnel? What's that? To protect the water supply. He built an incredible tunnel. There's lots of engineering things to do with this tunnel. And he brought the water from outside the wall, inside the wall, so that at a time of siege, there would be a constant water supply for the people inside the wall so that they could withstand the siege. The other significance of the pool of Siloam is this, is that at the Festival of Booths, we went over this also, at the Festival of Booths, they would take water from the pool of Siloam and they would take it into the temple and pour it at the base of the altar. Right? So there is a direct connection to the Festival of Booths, which is what we were just talking about, right, in chapter 7 and 8. So we're talking about the Festival of Booths. The pool of Siloam is where this water comes from. It's symbolic of God's provision for the nation of Israel. The water supplied in the wilderness, it's drawing attention to that. And so there is this connection. And so this pool is directly related to the Festival of Booths. And here we are, and this man is sent to that pool because the pool's name means sent. So the pool's name is sent. He sends the blind guy to the pool to wash the mud off, and the guy is healed, right? So there is all these connections, and then Jesus says in this passage, while I am in this world, I am what? The light of the world. What did he teach during the Festival of Booths? I'm the light of the world. Right? So in case you were a little confused as to whether there's a connection with all this stuff, there is a connection with all this stuff. Okay, so what is the question that the disciples ask when they see the man who has been born blind begging? Whose fault is it? Right? So, and his disciples ask him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? Okay, what are the theological implications of the question? That would be a question, a theological question related to their statement, yeah. If it was this man's parents that sinned, and this man was born blind, then why is this man being punished for the sins of his parents? But if he was blind since birth, why is he being punished for something that he was born with? Right? How does this work? Right? And what is the idea that this comes from? Right. That the illness was a direct punishment for some particular sin on somebody's part. And there were some ideas that one, Greek philosophy says that you have an eternal soul, and so that your soul could actually, and Origen kind of held with this, that you could actually sin before you were born. Right? So you were being punished now for things that you don't even remember. Okay? Yeah, okay. That's, it's a karma kind of thing, right? is that in my previous life, somebody I don't know, didn't remember, did something, and now I'm suffering for it. And when I do wrong, the guy who comes after me, or girl, or bug, or whatever, is going to suffer for that, right? But for the Jews, this philosophy had crept in with some. Some rabbis actually taught, apparently, that you could sin in the womb. We will get to that. Okay? But this idea of sin, of physical illness directly related to a sin, was pervasive, and still is pervasive, that you do a bad thing and a bad thing's going to happen to you. That is pervasive even today, even among non-Christians. Okay, so where would the Jews get this idea? From the Scripture, right? How so? Why would you say that the Scriptures, they would, by studying the Scriptures, get the idea that physical illness was a direct result of somebody's sin? Yes, sir. Right? So there is that kind of Absalom dies, or you're talking about the child that was conceived in adultery, and the child dies as a result of David's sin with Bathsheba. Right? What else would we say? Like, how else? Flesh this out a bit. What other scriptures can you think of that there is this direct connection between one's righteous behavior or unrighteous behavior and punishment for sin or blessing for righteousness? Right. Uzziah, right? There's just, it is pervasive in all of the Old Testament that there seems Abraham, who had a righteous life, was blessed in possessions. He was a wealthy guy, right? And we see that Job, at the start of the story, is extremely wealthy. At the end of the story, he's extremely wealthy, right? We see that there is this connection. The blessings and the cursings in the law point to prosperity and health. Right? So it's not given a cursory, a light, a superficial look at the Old Testament. It is not inconceivable to come to that conclusion, that it is a health and wealth gospel, right? That you're going to do good, and you're going to prosper, and you're going to be healthy. And if you do evil, then you're going to be poor, and you're going to have bad health. And that is the perspective. Now, if we're going to link this back to the man who was healed at the pool of Bethesda, how does that factor into this one? When Jesus goes and finds the man in the temple, what does he say to him? What's that?
He did not believe in him. Try out and be healed. He said, sin no more.
Lest something worse happen to you. What is the implication there? The implication is that you sinned and this happened. If you continue on sinning, something worse is going to happen. Right? So there is a connection between your sin and your physical well-being. Individual versus national cursing. Same as a lot of people confuse individual with national or civil justice, right? So you hear a lot of people say, oh, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, that, Gandhi has reported, well, then you'll just have a bunch of blind people walking around, right? it's that attitude that this was referring to individual justice, but it wasn't. It was a civil justice for the nation of Israel. A lot of the laws and regulations related to a civil law for the nation of Israel. A lot of the blessings and the curses were on a national level rather than an individual level. Does that mean, though, that there were no individual implications for blessings for righteousness and punishment for wickedness?
But isn't it the same today? If you live in sin, you are not going to succeed.
Isn't this fun? So, we got this. This is the question. Isn't it true today that if you live in sin, you won't be successful? And if you live in righteousness, you will be successful? Well, lots of wicked people prosper today. Was that the same in ancient Israel? Yes. Obviously it was, right? Obviously there is many people that prospered. We have in our minds the idea of good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Why? Because it's generally true. It is not always true. But we want to get into that. We have this fundamental attribution error, which is, what's the fundamental attribution error? It's one of my favorite errors. Because, I know that all sorts of bad things happen to you people because you people are bad. Anything bad that happens to me only happens because I'm unfortunate. I'm a good person. You guys, it just stands. Right? That's a fundamental attribution is that error is that bad things happen to you because they flaw in your character, right? And bad things happen to me because of bad luck. And good things happen to you out of good luck, and good things happen to me because I'm awesome, right? That's the fundamental attribution error, right? And it is this kind of thing that colored and still colors people's perspective. It's a common thing. And so when they see this man who's born blind, their immediate question is who sinned? Who is responsible for this man's condition? Did his parents sin? And if they sinned, then why is he being punished? Right? Or are the parents being punished through the child? Which was the case with David's child, right? David was being punished through the death of his son, right? Which makes us squirm a little bit, doesn't it? Or it makes me squirm a little bit, right? That my child would be punished because of I would be punished through my child's suffering. There seems to be this sort of natural law. Sorry. that was a theological poke. There's this natural law that righteousness exalts a nation. That when you do good things happen. That reasonable and rational people, right, that are operating against good reason and good rationale will follow some. Well, I'll just read it to you. Natural law is a theory of ethics that says that human beings possess intrinsic values that govern our reasoning and behavior. It states that there are universal moral standards that are seen across time periods and societies because these standards form the basis of a just society. So, and the idea is that in a society, when you operate against what we would say, and Aquinas would have, I think it was Aquinas, wasn't it? I'm pretty sure it was Aquinas. Anyways, that when you operate according to these standards, the society flourishes, right? And when you don't operate according to these standards, the society suffers, right? And as Mom pointed out, we see this all the time, that if a mom is an alcoholic, her child is going to have fetal alcohol syndrome, right? We see these babies who go through withdrawal because their mom was a drug addict. Did the baby do something that they're being punished for? Not directly, right? And we understand that in life, all of suffering and death comes from sin, right? That's its origin. But there are some things that are directly related to particular sins. The question is do we look at it from the perspective of, is this God operating in a specific way at a specific time to punish a particular sin, or is this just a general result of the fall? Right? And that's the crux of the matter that we struggle with is, when you hear about an earthquake in San Francisco or a flood in New Orleans, both places known for their wickedness, are those natural disasters a result of God's punishment, pouring out His wrath on the wicked, or are they the same as an earthquake in, say, a tsunami in Indonesia, or any other natural disaster? The tornado, the tornado that took out like a huge section of the west there. Where was that? Just recently. Yeah, Indianapolis and Arkansas, right? So we have these, we wrestle with this. We still wrestle with this on what is the relationship between suffering and God's punishment, right? So we see in the Scriptures that there are examples of people who were blessed, and it seemed to be directly related to their righteousness. But we also see people who prospered, and they were not nice people, right? We see people who were righteous and were punished. I said punished. Shame on me. People who were righteous and bad things happened to them, and people who were wicked and bad things happened to them. People who did bad things happened. People who did good things happened. People who did good, bad things happened. People who did good things happened. I got that right? Right? And the sun shines on the wicked and the good. Okay, so what is the biblical perspective that we have to espouse? What is our perspective? Like a rabbi a while back now wrote a book on why bad things happen to good people, right? And it was this long treatise, but it didn't really have any answers, right? It was unfortunate. What is the biblical perspective on this? Well, let's think about natural law. Is there such a thing as a natural law from a Christian perspective? What's that? What you sow, you will reap. We see in society that sin, and this should be fairly obvious, that sin impacts both personal and society as a whole, right? So, would we have to spend a lot of money on prisons and law enforcement if people didn't murder and steal and cheat and embezzle? Obviously not, right? Do those things have a negative impact on society and persons individually? Obviously they do. Like, there's no question about that. We all understand that if a person gives themselves over to some sort of addiction, whatever it may be, that is going to have a negative impact in their life. We also understand that, generally speaking, if somebody works hard, right, and is productive, that they will tend to prosper, right? If they're industrious, if they're not lazy, right? If they are lazy, there will be a negative impact. Is that universally true? And does the Bible teach that that's universally true? No, you could work hard. Think of Ecclesiastes. You work hard all your life, you build up a whole bunch of stuff, and then you die and some kid squanders the whole mess of it. Right? You don't control everything, and even those little things that you do control aren't guaranteed. Right? People can work all their life hard, and then one day the company comes in and says, "You're done." And they have climbed the corporate ladder, and they are way up there, and they're making a upper end six-figure salary, and the corporation just walks in one day and says, "See ya." And there's nothing they can do about it. They're not in... Yes, sir?
One of the interesting things of being a Christian is that we will suffer for righteousness.
Yeah, there's no question about it that suffering is not only is it just part of life, right? But we will suffer for the name of Christ. So we have a double suffering, right? We have the general suffering that everybody deals with, and we have the suffering that we are definitely going to be persecuted for Christ's name, and we will suffer. We are targets of Satan. There's no question about it. He doesn't like us, and he works against us. And in this world, you will have trouble. But don't worry, I have overcome the world. Did the Old Testament have a perspective that the wicked would never prosper and the righteous would always prosper, and the righteous would always do really well and would have lots? No, obviously not. Like Job, that's one of Job's complaints in chapter 21 is, why do the wicked still live? Continue on and also become very powerful. Their descendants are established with them in their sight and their offspring before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear, and the rod of God is not on them. His ox mates without fail. His cows calf and does not abort. They send forth their little ones like the flock, and their children skip about. They sing to the timbrel and harp and rejoice at the sound of the flute. They spend their days in prosperity, and suddenly they'll go down to Sheol. They say to God, "Depart from us. We don't even desire the knowledge of your ways. Who is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what would we gain if we entreat him? Behold, their prosperity is not in their hand. The counsel of the wicked is far from me." The point is that Job very well points out is that, and we see in Psalm 73 also, it talks about that the wicked prosper, that Hugh Hefner was a very wealthy man, right? Did his sin have consequences? Yes, in his life. There's no question about that. That there are consequences to your sin that are inescapable because of that sin is bad and it has bad consequences. But these wicked prosper. They do very well. And in the Old Testament, it was very obvious that the wicked prosper, right? And we still see it today, that people embezzle funds, and some of them get caught, but not all of them, right? And as Christians, we can make that mistake. We make two mistakes, actually. We can accuse those who prosper as having some sort of secret sin, right, that we just don't know about, and they must be evil because, they have money, right? And that is wrong. And we can also have the idea that they're doing well, so God must have blessed them, and they must be good people because God has blessed them in this. And that person is not doing well, and they must not be good because God must be punishing them for something. We can fall into those kind of things. We tend not to, as the church, attribute material or physical blessings to spiritual results. All right? Would you agree with that? I mean, there are health and wealth gospel preachers out there, And it is always it's like lottery tickets, right? It's spiritual lottery tickets. Because the people that tend to flock to these places and these churches tend to be poor. And they're looking to spin the wheel of God and make some sort of health and wealth. They want to acquire that. And so it's always kind of befuddling to me to see that. But generally, I think the church doesn't subscribe to that kind of thing. And obviously, Jesus is pointing out here that neither this man nor his parents are responsible. It's not that they haven't sinned. They're not sinless. It's that they haven't, this blindness is not as a result of their sin. And we see that constantly in this, in the teachings of Scripture, that some suffering is purely, and pointed suffering I'm talking about, not just general, but some pointed suffering is for the specific purpose of glorifying God in a specific instance. And in our lives, the suffering that surrounds us in people's lives is for what purpose? What is the purpose of the suffering in this man's life? That God might be glorified. So if your neighbor comes down with an illness, what is the purpose in that illness? What is a purpose, I should say, in that illness? To minister, to witness to them, and to seek to alleviate their suffering. Right? That we have the opportunity to do good to our neighbor, to love our neighbor as ourselves. And in doing so, we give glory to God by acts of mercy. It's what the church has been known for, is acts of mercy. And if we fail to do that, we fail to give God glory for the opportunity that He has given us to minister to somebody. And that's kind of a serious offense. We should always have our eyes open for opportunities to serve the Lord by being merciful and doing acts of kindness. And we should really look out for that. So the Christian perspective, the biblical perspective, is that there are numerous reasons. Sometimes it is God's punishment to somebody for sin. Sometimes it is not. It takes wisdom and discernment to understand when one is happening and when another. It takes wisdom and discernment to understand how to minister. It takes, and we see that sometimes it is chance that somebody is suffering. It has nothing to do with karma. Right? Why do I use the word chance? Because Jesus does. Jesus used the word chance when He talks about the man who was traveling in the story of the Good Samaritan. And He uses the word chance. Right? Because from our perspective, from a human perspective, we don't understand how God's sovereignty is working. And so we see these things happening, and since we don't understand, it is a chance occurrence from our perspective. Nothing is by chance, obviously, with God, but from our perspective, it's by chance. One of the problems that I thought about with this is that one of our problems as Christians is that we tend not to think about the why so much as the worthiness, as to whether they're worthy to receive our mercy. That seems to be, so when we think about what happened to this person, we think about, okay, well, they made their bed, they should lie in it. Right? And we have that kind of evaluation. Not, is this as a result of their sin from a, what is God doing perspective, but we look at it from our perspective and say, well, That's their fault. They're just going to have to deal with it. I'm not getting involved. Right? And we kind of make that evaluation. Now, it's time. There is wisdom in that sometimes it is better to minister to a person by not enabling them in their sin. There's no question about that. But there is also the factor that we have to be very careful in that, because by golly, if I don't think they're worthy, then I just don't have to help them, and I don't have to be bothered. Right? I don't have to get involved in somebody's life, because that can be messy, and I just don't want the hassle. Which is story of the Good Samaritan. Okay, we're done.